Someone leaves and takes the noise with them, and for a while the quiet feels like punishment. You interpret it as proof of something, that you weren't enough, that it was always fragile, that you should have seen it coming. The silence after a rupture has a way of talking. It fills itself with every doubt you were managing to keep at bay while the connection was still alive. But that's your silence. What happens in theirs is a different story. There's a moment and you won't see it, which is part of what makes it real, when the person who walked away realizes the script isn't going the way they expected. They left, and you didn't follow. No explanation offered. No door held open. No message at 2 in the morning, asking what went wrong. Just absence where there used to be availability, and something in that absence starts to press on them in a way that no argument ever could. A coworker once described this to me with a kind of bewildered honesty that stuck. She'd ended a friendship or drifted from it. She wasn't even sure which, and weeks later found herself thinking about the other person constantly. Not with guilt exactly, more like confusion. She said it felt like a sound she couldn't locate. The friendship had just gone quiet. No scene, no closure, no lingering thread to pull. And the lack of thread was the thing she couldn't stop reaching for. That's the mechanism this is actually about. Not silence as a move, not absence as leverage. But what happens bone deep when someone removes themselves so completely that the other person has nothing left to push against and realizes, in that unflinching clarity, what they actually had. What the body reaches for first is speech. Not because talking will fix anything. It won't, and some part of you already knows that. But because silence feels like an admission. Like if you don't explain yourself, the story gets written without you. So you reach for the phone. You compose the message in your head. You start with something measured and end up somewhere raw, and then you delete it, and then you write it again. Slightly different, slightly worse. That loop. Most people know that loop. Observation 1. The impulse to explain is almost never about clarity. It's about control. You want to be the one who defines what just happened before the other person gets to define it first. You want your version to land, and so the explanation becomes less about truth and more about positioning, which is its own kind of distortion, even if you don't notice it while you're doing it. Observation 2. The justification feels urgent because the silence reads as judgment. Someone stops responding, and the mind immediately fills the gap with verdict. They think you're cold. They think you didn't care. They're telling people a version of this that makes you the problem. You don't know any of that. You're inventing it. But the invention feels completely real, and it drives you toward the message, the call, the one more attempt at being understood. There's a specific kind of person, and I've been this person, which is why I can describe it with this much unsparing detail, who responds to rupture by becoming very, very articulate. Suddenly they can explain everything. Suddenly they have words for things they couldn't name while the connection was alive. The breakup, the falling out, the slow drift that finally became undeniable. It produces this strange clarity, except the clarity is in service of an argument nobody asked for. Observation 3. The message you almost send is almost always about you. Not about the relationship, not about the other person, not about what actually happened. It's about not being able to sit with what the silence implies. And the raw honesty of that, if you can get to it, if you can strip it down far enough, is that you're not trying to fix anything. You're trying to feel less exposed. There's a difference. Most people spend a lot of energy not seeing it. The phone stays in your hand, or you put it down and pick it up 3 minutes later. Or you don't send the message but you rehearse it so completely that it might as well have been sent. You've had the conversation, you've gotten the response you wanted. You've resolved something in your own head that has no resolution in the actual world. And then you come back to the silence, which hasn't changed, which was never going to change because of anything you typed. What the impulse doesn't account for, what it genuinely cannot see from inside itself, is that the silence on the other end is doing something. Not because you planned it, not because you're running some clean psychological operation, but because absence, when it's real, when it has no performance in it, creates a pressure that words never could. The person who left was prepared for your reaction. They had rehearsed it too, in their own way. They knew what they would say when you reached out. They had a position ready, and the reaching out never came. They had a script. That's the part that doesn't get said out loud, but it's true, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The person who walked away from the relationship, from the friendship, from whatever it was, had already run the next scene in their head before they left. They knew their lines. They knew approximately what your lines would be, and the scene had a shape. You would reach out. They would respond from a position of distance. You would explain yourself. They would feel confirmed in their decision, or softened enough to reconsider, and either way the story would continue with them holding the narrative. What they did not script was nothing. Observation 4. Leaving carries an implicit expectation of being followed. Not always consciously, not always with that level of raw honesty about the motive, but the exit is designed, even when it doesn't feel designed, to produce a specific response. The door is left slightly open. The last message has just enough edge to invite a reply. The silence from their side is a kind of bait, and what they're waiting for, without fully admitting it, is proof that you felt the loss enough to move toward them. When you don't move, the bait just sits there, and eventually they have to look at it. Think about how this plays out in a family situation. A parent and an adult child who've had a serious falling out. The parent stops calling. Dramatically, pointedly. The silence is loud in a way that's meant to be heard. They're waiting for the child to crack, to reach out first, to come with some version of an apology, or at least an opening. Weeks pass. The child for once doesn't reach out. Not out of cruelty. Just out of exhaustion, maybe, or a bone-deep understanding that reaching out will reset nothing, will only restart the same cycle with the same positions. And then something strange happens. The parent, who was so certain of their leverage, starts to feel uncertain. The silence they created starts to press on them differently. They don't have the reaction they needed to feel justified. And without the justification, they're left alone with the actual question of what they want. Observation 5. The absence of reaction is disorienting, in a way that reaction, even negative reaction, never is. When you argue back, when you plead, when you send the long message at midnight, you give the other person something to do with their feelings. You give them a target, you give them the role of the one who is being pursued, which is a role that comes with a certain clarity and even a certain comfort. They know where they stand. They know what they're refusing. But when you go quiet, genuinely, cleanly quiet, they lose the target. And without the target, they have to turn the lens somewhere else. This is not, and I want to be careful here because this is where the idea gets distorted. This is not a technique. The moment you perform the silence, the moment you do it to produce a specific result, it collapses. The other person can feel the difference between absence and strategy. Absence has no texture. It doesn't lean. It doesn't wait with visible impatience. Real silence is just the space where you used to be, now empty. And that emptiness has a weight that no carefully crafted message could manufacture. Observation 6. What the person who left actually finds, in the absence of pursuit, is their own reflection. They built a version of what happened that positioned them correctly as the one who made the reasonable decision, the one who couldn't be treated that way, the one who had every right, and that version needed your reaction to stay intact. Your distress would confirm that the loss was real. Your pursuit would confirm that they had value. Your anger would confirm that they had power. Without any of those inputs, the version starts to develop cracks, not because they're suddenly wrong about everything, but because the story was always partly constructed, and constructed things need maintenance, and they were counting on you to provide the material. There's something almost clinical about watching this process from the outside, if you've ever had the strange vantage point of being the one who went quiet without planning to. You didn't choose silence as a move. You chose it because you had nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, or because something in you finally understood that more words were only going to dig the same hole deeper. And then, weeks later, something shifts on their end. A message, an accidental encounter, a mutual friend who mentions carefully that the other person seems unsettled, not broken, not desperate, just unsettled in a way they weren't before. That unsettled feeling has a name in the stripped-down language of how people actually function. It's the sensation of losing a story you were depending on. You can't grieve cleanly what you told yourself you didn't want. You can't dismiss easily what stopped asking to be taken seriously. The silence, it turns out, was not the end of the conversation. It was the beginning of a different one, the one the other person has to have entirely alone, without your lines, without your reactions, without the structure they were counting on you to provide. And that conversation, the internal one, the one that happens in the unguarded quiet of 3 in the morning, when the constructed version of events starts to feel less solid than it did, that's the one that actually moves things. Not the argument, not the explanation, the absence of both. The conversation they're having alone isn't comfortable. That's the part worth sitting with. Observation 7. The mind needs friction to function in a certain way. When there's conflict, when there's pursuit, when there's someone on the other end reacting, the nervous system has somewhere to put its energy. There's a problem with a shape. But when the other person goes clean and quiet, the energy has nowhere to go. It starts to turn inward. And turning inward, for someone who just made a major decision they were certain about, is not a pleasant experience. Observation 8. Certainty is surprisingly fragile without external confirmation. You can be completely sure you made the right call and still feel destabilized when the person you left doesn't seem to need you to have been wrong. The destabilization isn't logical. It doesn't mean the decision was bad. It just means the certainty was partly borrowed from the assumption that the other person's reaction would validate the weight of the choice. Someone ends a working relationship with a collaborator they'd known for years. Clean break their decision. Reasons they stood behind. They expected some pushback, some attempt at repair. Instead, nothing. The collaborator moved forward without a word, and the person who ended it found themselves, 3 weeks later, second-guessing things they had been completely sure of. Not because they were wrong, because the silence gave them no resistance to push against, and without resistance, their own certainty had nothing to prove itself against. Observation 9. Discomfort without a target becomes self-examination. That's the mechanism. Not magic, just the mind doing what minds do when the external noise stops. And here's what self-examination does to a story that was only half built on solid ground. Observation 10. Every version of events has gaps. The person who left filled those gaps with assumptions about how you would behave, and those assumptions were load-bearing. They held the structure together. Your predicted desperation confirmed their narrative of being someone worth chasing. Your predicted anger confirmed their narrative of being someone who had to escape. Your predicted silence, if they even considered it, was probably framed as indifference, as proof that you never really cared that much anyway. But genuine absence doesn't read as indifference up close. It reads as something harder to categorize, and things that are hard to categorize don't stay neatly in the story. Observation 11. When the expected inputs don't arrive, the story has to be rewritten. Not consciously, not in one sitting, but gradually, the way a building shifts when one of its supports is removed. The person starts reaching back through the history of the connection, looking for the material they need to feel certain again. And what they find, reduced to what actually happened rather than what they needed to have happened, is more complicated than the clean version they were carrying. This is the part I'm genuinely uncertain how to describe. Not because it's abstract, but because it happens differently for different people, and I don't want to flatten it into something neater than it is. For some people it arrives as a specific memory that suddenly feels different than it did before, a moment they'd classified as evidence of one thing that now, without the surrounding narrative, looks like evidence of something else entirely. For others, it's less specific, just a general loosening of the certainty, a sense that the story they were telling was maybe edited more heavily than they realized. Someone walks away from a long friendship, years of it, real history, the kind of friendship that had seen them through actual difficulty. They had their reasons, clear ones, or so they felt. They told the story to mutual friends, and it landed the way they needed it to land. And then the other person just disappeared. No reaction, no defense, no attempt to win anyone over to their side. Just absence. And slowly, over weeks, the person who left started noticing that the story they were telling required the other person to be a certain way, required them to be wounded, or reactive, or diminished by the loss. And the other person in their silence was not performing any of those things, which meant either they didn't care, possible, cold, but possible, or the story had been built around a version of them that wasn't entirely accurate. Observation 12. Losing control of the narrative is not the same as losing the argument. The person who left might still be correct about every specific thing they claimed. The facts might be exactly as they described them. But the meaning of those facts, the interpretation, the emotional logic that made the departure feel not just justified but necessary, that part was always more fragile than the facts themselves. And the silence, by refusing to provide the expected confirmation, exposes that fragility in a way that no counter-argument ever could. An argument gives you something to defeat. Silence gives you nothing to defeat, which means you're left holding the argument alone, and arguments held alone have a tendency to start interrogating themselves. The raw honesty of that process, if the person can stay in it long enough, is where the real reckoning begins. Not with you, with themselves, with the gap between what they told people and what they actually know happened, with the parts of the story that required your reaction to stay intact. You didn't create that gap, it was always there. The silence just stopped covering it. The gap, once visible, has a specific quality to it. It doesn't feel like an absence of information, it feels like the presence of something that was there the whole time and is only now undeniable. Observation 13. People don't miss what they have. They miss what they had access to and no longer do. While the connection was alive, while you were available, responsive, present, the value of that was largely invisible, not because the person was ungrateful necessarily, but because availability is like air. You don't think about air until the room changes. The silence changes the room, and suddenly things that were background become foreground. The specific way you understood something about them that other people didn't, the particular quality of ease that existed in that dynamic, the thing they could say to you that they couldn't quite say to anyone else without it requiring more explanation than it was worth. Observation 14. What emerges in the absence of pursuit is a confrontation with actual loss, as opposed to symbolic loss. Symbolic loss is what people perform when they leave. It's the loss of the idea of the relationship, the loss of the role they occupied, the loss of the story they were part of. Actual loss is quieter and more specific. It's the Tuesday afternoon when something happened, and there's no one to tell it to who would understand it with the same bone-deep shorthand. It's the particular laugh that nobody else has. It's the version of yourself that only existed inside that specific connection, and that version has nowhere to go now. Most people, when they walk away from something real, are braced for the symbolic loss. They've rehearsed it, they've processed it, or told themselves they have. What they're not braced for is the specific, undeniable texture of the actual loss arriving on an ordinary day when they weren't thinking about it at all. A person ends a relationship, not dramatically, not after a single event, but after a slow accumulation of reasons that all made sense individually. They felt clear about it. They moved forward. And then one day, several weeks later, something funny happens, the specific kind of funny that would have landed perfectly with the person they left, and they reach for their phone before they remember. That reach, that reflex that has nowhere to go, is the actual loss making itself known, not the idea of the relationship, the real thing, the actual specific irreplaceable thing. Observation 15. The silence accelerates this confrontation because it removes the buffer. If you had argued, pleaded, or pursued, the other person could have stayed in the symbolic version, the version where leaving was clean and correct and they were moving forward. Your absence forces the actual version into view. There's no drama to focus on, no conflict to justify the distance, no ongoing story to inhabit, just the clean, unmediated reality of what is no longer there. And clean realities, when they're real losses, have a way of arriving with full force. But the other side of this, the side that rarely gets examined, is what the silence does to the person maintaining it. Not what it does to their strategy, what it does to them. Observation 16. Staying quiet after a rupture is not a passive act. It requires something specific from you, a kind of specific honesty about what you're actually doing and why. Because the temptation is constant. Not just the temptation to reach out, but the temptation to perform the silence, to make it visible, to let it be known, through some indirect channel, that you are very much not reaching out. And have you noticed? The moment that happens, the moment the silence becomes a display, it stops being silence and starts being a different kind of noise. And the difference between those two things is the difference between clarity and manipulation, even when the manipulation is subtle enough that you can almost convince yourself it isn't happening. Real silence, the kind that actually shifts things, comes from a place that has nothing to prove. And getting to that place is harder than it sounds, because most of us, when we've been left or dismissed or quietly deprioritized, have something to prove. We want to be seen as fine. We want to be seen as not waiting. We want the other person to know somehow that we are living our life with complete composure and zero preoccupation with their absence, which is of course its own form of preoccupation. Observation 17. The silence that comes from clarity feels different from the inside than the silence that comes from strategy. Strategy has a hum to it, a low, persistent frequency of monitoring. Are they seeing this? Are they feeling this? Is it working? Clarity is quieter than that. It's the silence that comes when you've looked at the situation with stripped-down honesty and understood, without drama, that there is nothing left to say that would change the fundamental shape of what happened. Not because you've given up, because you've seen it clearly enough that the urge to explain has lost its urgency. I reached that place once. I'm not sure I handled everything before it well, which is its own admission, but there was a specific moment where I stopped composing the unsent message. Not because I decided to stop, because I genuinely no longer needed the other person to understand. And what surprised me was how different that felt from resignation. Resignation is heavy, slow, defeated. This was something else, something more like the room after a long noise finally stops. Clean. A little raw but clean. Observation 18. What the silence reveals about you, if you can maintain it from that place, is the location of your actual center. Because the center, the real one, doesn't require the other person's response to remain intact. It doesn't need their acknowledgement of what the connection was worth. It doesn't need their regret, their return, their eventual understanding. Those things might come, they might not, but the center exists independent of them, and the silence, real silence, not performed silence, is where you find out whether you actually believe that or just want to. There's a specific clarity that comes from sitting with your own absence in someone else's life and not flinching from what it shows you. You see what you were actually attached to. Not the person sometimes, or not only the person, but the version of yourself that existed inside that dynamic. The particular way you felt understood, or needed, or seen. And when the connection ends, and the silence holds, that version of yourself has to find another way to exist. Or you have to decide it doesn't need to exist in that form anymore. Either way, something real is happening. Something that no amount of explanation or pursuit would have forced into the open. Epictetus made a distinction that most people hear once and forget, between what is up to us and what isn't. It sounds clean in theory. In practice, after a rupture, it cuts somewhere specific. The story you keep running about what was lost is up to you. The loss itself isn't. The silence, when it's real, forces that distinction into view. It doesn't end the pain, but it stops feeding the part of the pain that lives entirely on narrative, on a story you are choosing, whether you know it or not, to keep telling. And those are two very different things to be carrying. Two different things happening in the same silence. That's what makes this worth examining carefully, rather than just feeling your way through it. On one side, the person who left is working through the slow erosion of a story that needed your reaction to stay solid. On your side, if you found the real version of the quiet, the one that comes from clarity rather than from strategy, something different is happening. Something different from victory or punishment, closer to a return to yourself that you maybe didn't realize you drifted from while the connection was alive. Observation 19. The silence after a rupture is the only condition under which both people can encounter what was real about the connection, as opposed to what was functional about it. While the relationship was active, while the friendship was running, while the dynamic was in motion, everything was filtered through use. What does this person give me? What do I give them? What role do I play? What role do they play? What are the unspoken agreements about how this works? None of that is cynical. It's just how connections function when they're functioning. But it means that the actual value of the thing, the bone-deep, undeniable value, often only becomes visible when the function stops. This is why the silence is not a weapon, even when it produces results that look like weapons produce. A weapon is aimed at someone. The silence, when it's real, isn't aimed at anyone. It's just the space that exists when you stop filling it. And in that space, both people encounter something they couldn't encounter while the noise was running. Consider someone who goes through a serious rupture with a sibling, years of accumulated tension, a final incident that broke something, and then nothing. No family mediation, no group chat intervention, no carefully worded letter, just the end of contact, clean and without announcement. Months pass. The sibling who initiated the distance expected. At some point, a response, a reaction, some indication that the other person was feeling the absence. Instead, they got the absence itself, unaccompanied. And what happened over those months was not that the person who went quiet won something. It's that both of them, separately, had to sit with what the relationship actually was, not what they wished it had been, not what they told other people it was, but the actual, unvarnished reality of it. For one of them, that process led to grief. For the other, to a clarity about their own limits that they hadn't been able to reach while the connection kept demanding their attention. Neither outcome is a victory. Both outcomes are real. Observation 20. The synthesis. If there is one, and I'm not certain there always is, which is something I think deserves to be said plainly, rather than papered over with false resolution, the synthesis is not that silence makes people come back. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the process I've been describing leads the person who left to reach out, to reconsider, to want to repair something. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the silence just confirms the distance, and both people continue forward without the connection. Both of those are valid outcomes of the same process. The silence doesn't guarantee a return. It guarantees an encounter with reality. And reality doesn't always produce the result you want. What it does produce, consistently, is this: a stripped-down version of the situation that both people have to deal with on their own terms. No performance, no reaction to manage, no ongoing negotiation of positions. Just what was there, and what is now gone, and what that means when examined without the noise that usually covers it. The person who went quiet, if it was clarity rather than strategy, if it was a genuine return to their own center, comes out of the silence with something quieter than return or vindication. A kind of raw honesty about what they're able to carry and what they're not, about what they need from connection and what they were willing to accept as a substitute for it, about the difference between someone being present in your life and someone occupying space in it. Those are not the same thing, and most people spend years not examining the difference because the connections keep moving and the noise keeps running, and there's never a clean enough moment to look at it directly. The silence creates that moment, passively, just by being what it is, the absence of the thing that was covering the question. If you are in the middle of something like this right now, not reading about it, actually in it, actually sitting with the specific texture of a connection that has gone quiet on one end or the other, the most honest thing I can offer is this: the silence is not the end of the story. It's the part of the story where the real material surfaces. What you do with that material, what you let yourself see in it, what you're willing to be unflinching about rather than comfortable about, that part belongs entirely to you. Not to them, not to what they decide to do next. To you, and to whatever you find when you stop filling the space with noise and let the actual shape of things become visible. That shape is sometimes painful. It is almost always more honest than anything that came before it. And honest, even when it's difficult, is the only ground solid enough to build anything real on, whether that's a repaired connection, a completed grief, or simply a clearer understanding of what you actually want from the people you let into your life. What you find in the quiet, if you stay in it long enough, was there before the silence started. The silence just stopped covering it. There's a particular kind of afternoon that arrives without warning, sometime after everything has settled, after the silence has run its course, after the initial rawness has dulled into something more manageable, after you've stopped rehearsing the conversations that never happened. The afternoon where you're doing something ordinary, making coffee, walking somewhere that doesn't require your full attention, sitting in a room that's just a room, not a room where you're recovering from something. And in that afternoon, you notice that the space the connection used to occupy has changed shape. It's still there. You're not going to pretend it isn't. And anyone who tells you the goal is to feel nothing has never actually felt something, but it no longer pulls at you the way it did. It's become something you carry rather than something that carries you. And there's a difference between those two things that is almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't felt it, but is completely undeniable once you have. That afternoon is not a reward. It's not something the silence earns you. It's just what the other side of a real process feels like when you let the process be what it is instead of what you wanted it to be. I think about a conversation I had once, not about a relationship, about something smaller on the surface, a professional rupture that turned out to be less small than it appeared, where someone described coming out the other side of a long silence feeling, in their words, surprisingly clean. Not happy, not vindicated, clean, like something that had been running just below the threshold of notice for years had finally switched off, and they hadn't realized how much of their energy it had been consuming until they felt the difference. They didn't get what they wanted from the situation. The other person never reached out. Nothing was repaired or explained or closed in the way they'd once hoped. The silence just went on long enough that they stopped waiting for it to produce something, and in the stopping, they found the thing they'd been looking for in entirely the wrong place. The clarity they'd been trying to extract from the other person's reaction had been available to them the whole time. They'd just been too busy composing the unsent message to find it. That's the stripped-down version of everything this has been about. Not a technique, not a system, just the honest observation that most of what we chase from other people after a rupture, the acknowledgement, the regret, the evidence that we mattered, is something we're actually looking for in ourselves. And the silence, when it's real, when it comes from a place that has nothing to prove, creates the only conditions under which you can find it in the right location. The other person may come back. They may not. Either way, something has shifted that belongs entirely to you. If you've been watching these and finding something useful in them, subscribing costs nothing and helps everything. Same with the like button. Same with the hype thing that appears after. That's how this works.